welcome to the Inkspot podcast, and a big welcome to author Annie Dawid, who is also a lecturer and an academic. And she's the author of 6 books. And the last one, Paradise Undone, is a novel of Jonestown. And we're actually releasing this podcast on the 18th of November, which is the 47th anniversary of the terrible tragedy that happened in Guyana. And Annie is somewhat of an expert on this, having spent probably close to 20 years researching this. Is that right, Annie?
21 years.
So before we get into the events that led to the terrible tragedy in the Guyanese jungle, do you want to just give a little précis about your career and basically what led you to write about Jonestown?
Yes, I was giving a reading of an unrelated story at the University of North Dakota in 2004, where I was a guest master teacher for a week. And in my story, which was about these 2 sisters who had fled New York, where I grew up, a New York suburb, for this, what they call a no-name cult, this little cult in the Southwest. I was reading about how the parents went to a deprogrammer, which back in the day was a big thing when parents were trying to get their kids out of cults, and they'd pay a deprogrammer, which was sometimes looked upon as kidnapping.
Mm.
In this case, I made up the event, although in real life, the parents did go to a deprogrammer. And I had the deprogrammer say, well, just so you know, my daughter died in Jonestown, because this was happening in 1982 and Jonestown was 78. And that was the only time Jonestown was mentioned in this super long story. So I wasn't thinking about Jonestown particularly. And after the reading, the director came up, who was a friend of mine, and he was crying. And he was telling me how these friends of his had family who died in Jonestown. And that was a very, very powerful reaction, which I had not received giving readings for all those years before. So a month later, I was preparing for my sabbatical, where I was going to write my next book called Hippie Ruins, about these hippie communes in southern Colorado. And I was in the bookstore aisle, and I was at CO, and I was looking at communes, and I moved down a little, and I got to CU, to cults. And there were all these books about Jonestown, ton of books, and I was planning to do research, and I made this decision right then. I call it my bookstore aisle epiphany, that I was going to write about Jonestown, and the hippie ruins could wait. And so this is 2004, and really what I was thinking about was how people followed the cult leader of Osama bin Laden, 19 of them, to get on planes and kill 3,000 people in New York City, the Al-Qaeda followers. And I was thinking how following somebody like that made no sense. So that was a homicidal following. And people think of Jonestown as being suicidal. And there was some suicide that happened that day, but it was really a mass murder more than it was a mass suicide, because there were guards with guns pointed at everyone while they were standing up for the Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid, the Flavor Aid, which had cyanide in it. So that's the genesis of how I came to start this novel.
Okay, yeah. And actually, what you've just mentioned, that it wasn't a mass suicide. As you say, there was some suicide. It was mainly murder, certainly murder of infants, children, babies, and
old people.
And old people who were unable to defend themselves. And yet the Jonestown victims have been painted by history as mindless zombies who just drank the Kool-Aid, and it was Flavor Aid. And they've been sort of written off by history as people who were somehow weak-minded.
At the time that what came out, the cult of death, and it's just all these dead bodies, faceless dead bodies. You don't even get a human face on. And that was the same cover in many news magazines.
So your novel is a very powerful attempt to humanize the people who died in Jonestown. And also it does a really good job of explaining why those people had taken the decision to go to Guyana in the first place. Many of them were Black. Over 70% of the victims were Black, and they had escaped in America, which in which life was pretty intolerable for them. Perhaps you could describe a little bit of the backgrounds of some of these people.
Yeah. So in my novel, I focused on 4 human beings who had Jonestown connections. One of them was a guy who went by Watts, who was from Watts. That wasn't his real name. And so he would be an example who represented many of the inhabitants of first the People's Temple in California, and then what Jonestown was called the People's Temple Agricultural Project. That was its official name, and the idea was they were going down there to build a utopia far from civilization, and they would be self-sufficient. And it's a very actually American thing to try and start utopias. That's what the Brits and the Dutch were doing when they first showed up on the North American continent in the 1600s.
But Annie, everyone dreams of a utopia. The problem is that everyone dreams of making a fresh start away from whatever it was that dragged them down at home. And yet, as human beings, we cannot help but bring our baggage with us.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah, Jones called it the Promised Land. And so it had a lot of bad, I mean, he called it the Promised Land when they were back in the US. It's like, we're getting ready to go to Guyana. But, you know, as most utopians end up, it was quite the dystopia. It didn't fulfill almost any of its promise. Although for some of the old people, especially who had come from inner cities where they were scared to go outside, where there were needles around where they lived, etc. That for them, Jonestown, it was beautiful. It was the jungle and peaceful.
and they didn't have to work in the fields like the younger people did. They didn't have to,
Right.
which was really backbreaking work. And also,
Yes.
most people who were there were actually fed a pretty low protein diet. They lived on rice and bananas. And just going back to the old people before we get distracted, they were also given medical care, dental care, and
Yes.
they no longer had to choose between eating and their medicine, for example. And so
Exactly.
from the old people's perspective, it must have seemed pretty flipping cool. And
Yeah. So yes.
and yet the younger ones, as we've discussed, they had a low protein diet, had to do backbreaking work. And also they were chronically sleep deprived because Jim Jones had this terrible habit of getting onto the intercom or whatever megaphone system they had and ranting in the middle of the night. And so when you combine all these factors, it is really no wonder that this paranoia set in, that it's us against the rest of the world. And Jim Jones was able to exploit that and ensure that, people were compliant.
Yes. Yes. And then when you're physically worn down, which is out of the playbook of brainwashing, you are less and less able to have a mental defense against what you're hearing day and night. And when he wasn't talking on the public address system, they were playing tapes of him talking.
And yet, even so, there were plenty of people who really wanted to leave and felt they were unable to. First of all, their passports were confiscated. And obviously, from Jones's perspective, the more people he had in Jonestown, the more social security checks he was receiving every month, the
Right.
more viable the project became. And so, and obviously, the more people that defected, the more the people who remained behind would question why that was the case. And so, as in always, all these cults, defection is a sign of that there's something terribly wrong. And obviously, he was willing to do pretty much anything to stop that.
Yes.
So the
Yes.
level of coercion was high.
Very, very high. And there were some people who tried to escape and were caught and beaten so that they wouldn't do it again. But there were also some successful escapes, most pointedly on the day of the massacre, which happened in the late afternoon, evening. But that morning, there was a group of African American family and friends, they weren't all related, who walked out of Jonestown and the jungle. They went 30 miles to the next town. They didn't go to the close by town because they didn't want to get seen there. And that family and their friends, all those people, 9 of them were fine. And so that story doesn't get told as often as it might. And that woman, Leslie Wagner Wilson, who was kind of the leader of this band, she is starting a podcast, which will begin today on the 18th, and it's called Black Jonestown.
Okay.
And she's telling the story specifically from an African American perspective, which has been missing from the conversation for nearly 50 years, for the most part.
Definitely work. We'll put a link to that when it's available.
Okay.
Is she going to interview survivors or family members, or do you know what?
So I don't know what the format is going to be. It's a mystery right now, but it has more than one part. And I'm guessing that will be, she is herself a survivor and will be doing other interviews with survivors.
And there were a couple of people at the dentist that day, and also Jones and Marceline's son was away with a football team.
Basketball,
that's it. Sorry.
right. There were a number of young men who were on that basketball team from Jonestown. So yeah, there's a contingent of survivors, we call them survivors of Jonestown, who weren't there on that day. They were in the capital. And then many others were back in San Francisco at the temple headquarters, which provided all the supplies for Jonestown, which is an enormous job, shipping like everything you needed from the States to Jonestown.
And I presume they were doing all the administrative work behind the scenes to ensure that Social Security was getting through and all that,
Yes.
all that kind of stuff.
Yes, and doing some PR work for Jonestown with the Guyanese government in the capital. I'm talking now about the capital headquarters for the People's Temple, which was another place where there were a lot of people who were surviving in Georgetown.
Because it was a huge undertaking to transport so many people to effectively the jungle, where there
was no infrastructure.
No, but I mean in a country which had limited resources and infrastructure.
They were they cleared 300 acres of jungle, and they built a small city there with all of the infrastructure. I mean, it's quite a phenomenal accomplishment, what they ended up doing. Those were called the Jonestown Pioneers, the people who went over earlier in 1973. And so they were there. That's 5 years before the massacre. And they were just building and clearing and making crops and, really starting a life from nothing. And so I feel like it's an incredible accomplishment what those people did. As one or more person has said, the only thing wrong with Jonestown was Jones.
Well, yes, but there was also an inner circle around Jones as well, who fed his ego and increased that feeling he had that he was somehow messianic. Is that even the right way to pronounce it?
Yeah, that's fine.
He was some kind of messiah, and he had this not only a God complex, but a persecution complex as well.
Yes. I mean, part of that was enabled by his drug addiction, which was in turn enabled by these women in the inner circle, which included his wife, who was an RN, and there were other medical people. And one of the great ironies out of many is that one of their most successful programs back in the States was getting people off of drugs.
Wow, that is very ironic.
Yeah. And to my knowledge, I have never read about anyone trying to approach Jim Jones to say you need to get clean. Because it seems like they would have been able to do it because they had done it with so many other people. And in fact, the doctor at Jonestown had come to People's Temple as a junkie. He was a Jewish Texan, middle class, who arrived in San Francisco like so many hippie types, and one with a drug problem. And so he got clean in the temple, and the temple sent him to med school. So, very awfully, this man is also the engineer of the poison.
Yes.
He did all the research and made the poison. So I'm not saying he's a good guy. I'm just saying he had been a drug addict and then became a productive member of the community because he got clean. But like I said, I've never seen anything about somebody trying to get the leader clean. And in fact, his drug use just got worse and worse and worse.
And just going back to the individual you just described, it's really incredible to be given a second chance and then to misuse it in that way. It's just so appalling, isn't it?
Right. But for him, his name was Dr. Larry Schacht. He's one of those young men who saw Jones as a messiah figure because he had been so down and out, and then he came back and became a doctor, which was probably what his middle-class Jewish parents had hoped for him from the very beginning, and then he descended into drugs. So there were some young men who were in his thrall, and many know that Jones was bisexual and did have affairs with men. And I can't say for certain that he had an affair with the doctor, but there was definitely this unequal power relationship between them.
Yes. And also we're probably getting ahead of ourselves, but I was really interested in the custody battle about the little boy, John, and whose mother had to leave she had to leave him behind in People's Temple before they went to Guyana. Isn't that right?
Yes, correct.
And then she immediately started trying to getting the law on her side to get her son back. And
right.
And
some people see that as one of the triggers for the massacre, because Jones refused to give up this boy. So he was supposedly the boy's father,
Mm.
but that was never proved, like with DNA or anything. And the boy's legal father, Grace's husband, was super high up in the organization, and he had defected, I believe, within a year of the massacre. And so the two of them, even though they weren't married anymore, they were trying as hard as they could to get their son out of Jonestown. And Jones was adamant that that would never happen. And actually, he had some collusion with the Guyanese judiciary, who, like, they went out and posted a what do you call that? A summons that
Mm.
he needed to come to court in Georgetown, and he refused, and they dropped it. Nobody had made him come to Georgetown to go to court about the custody of this little boy. He was 6. His name was John Victor Stone.
Why do you think this child was so important to Jones?
Um,
When there were so many other, I mean, there were 33 babies born in Jonestown.
right,
So,
right.
and
Well,
he and Marceline had adopted a number of Black and several mixed race children,
yes.
and they had their own son, Marcus. So,
Yeah. In real life, Marcus's name is Stephen.
sorry, that's
Yeah.
my
Stephen
mistake. And
Jones.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I believe it was really about ownership.
yes,
And Jones felt like he owned this boy, and this boy was noticeably white, okay, because there's always this undercurrent of racism when you talk about Jones. He slept with so many white people, but he attempted to sleep with only one Black woman who rejected him. This was in Jonestown. She was 19 also, and so he's in his 40s, and she got punished, as one of the ways they were punishing people in Jonestown was being injected with sedatives or depressants. And so that was her story. But let me get back to John Victor Stone. So he had the name of that fancy lawyer who had just defected, who went to Stanford. And I think that was also part of the cachet of this boy. So it became this tug of war possession issue. He also had another son who was around the same age, with Carolyn Layton, who had other last names.
mm.
Moore was her original name. And so these two boys, they were actually found in the cabin where they lived with Jones and the mother and the mistress, and not Mrs. Jones, but his other bedmates. They all lived in this, like, well-appointed cabin, as opposed to every other place in Jonestown, which was very, bare bones.
Mm.
And so anyway, they were not among the pile of bodies. They had their own pile of bodies that were specific to that cabin.
But there is it's very interesting you talk about that poor girl who was plied with sedatives for having the temerity to turn down Jim Jones, because one of the defining characteristics of People's Temple, certainly before they went to Guyana, was the brotherly love aspect and the promise that everyone would be treated equally. Whereas in fact, in reality, once the project became underway, you had once more this depressing hierarchy of a white hierarchical inner circle and
Mm-hmm.
Black people supporting it with their labor
Yes.
and their social
Yes.
security check. And
Yes.
I'm just astonished that that wasn't picked up on sooner, I suppose.
Right. Well, I do want to point out that in 1973, a group of young people, they're called the Gang of Eight Revolutionaries. And so interestingly, they had been going to college. The People's Temple sent them to college because they wanted their people to get educated. And that group was 4 men and 4 women, 4 Black and 4 white. Some of them were couples.
Mm.
And kind of the leader, who I want to write about in my next book, Jim Cobb, who died recently, they wrote this manifesto to Jones complaining about how the inner circle was almost entirely white. Like there was a token Black man and a token Black woman, but everybody else was white. And so he or they, I'm not sure who actually authored the manuscript, but there are these 8 names on it. So they complained, and then they fled because they were worried about retribution, because he was always threatening retribution on anybody who left. And so they went and hid out. They were like traveling around the Western United States from like cheap hotel to cheap hotel, hoping they weren't being tracked.
Wow.
And they weren't. And all those people survived. They survived that 1973, leaving the temple, that is. And one of the really sad things among them, so Jim Cobb had a sister who was also part of the Gang of Eight. But back in Jonestown, later on, they had like 4 other siblings and their mother. So that family got split up at the time in 73. And that was not unusual, where some people would leave, but other family members would stay.
Yeah.
And so Jim Cobb ended up in the Concerned Relatives, the group that was trying to get people out of there. And he ended up on the plane with Leo Ryan. So he saw his family members the day of the massacre. He was like having lunch with them and talking. And he got back to the airstrip with the congressman and the others, and he was shot at. I don't think he was injured. I think he fled into the jungle. But so, yeah, he had the smarts to see very early on what so many other people were blind to, and to have the courage to voice his dissent along with some others. And so it wasn't entirely unseen, that kind of racism in the inner circle.
And presumably he tried to get his family members to leave that day.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly what happened, but I'm pretty sure his siblings, and some of them had kids there also. So he had nieces or nephews. They were very diehard Jones people. So I don't think, from everything I've read, I've never seen that family listed as among the people who were trying to get out that day.
So just going back to the conditions in the camp, and, you know, obviously hard though they must have been, there must have been a sense that everyone there was part of something.
Yes.
And one of the things that you highlight in your book is how, you know, the people who were left behind in the States had a kind of, first of all, an envy that they were not part of it. And then obviously they suffered afterwards from survivor's guilt.
Right.
Because it must have come as a huge shock to them. You know, I know that Jones was preparing people with his white knights. You know, can you just describe what those were?
Yes. So yes, it came as a surprise to some, but not all, because he'd been prepping them for a mass suicide for many years, including before Jonestown. So some of them who were still in San Francisco were probably shocked but not surprised when it actually happened, because in the way brainwashing works, you get used to something horrible which you would never get used to, but you have repetition, and so it becomes not so extraordinary. So some of them had already been through more than one. A white night was when the People's Temple members were told, okay, we're under attack, we're going to have to drink the poison and commit suicide, and this is going to test your loyalty, and they would have to drink something, a liquid. And before November 18th, the liquid was always free of poison. So they would drink it, even though they might be expecting to die, but then they didn't die. So you do that a few times. And so it is possible on the very last day that some of them, especially the ones at the front of the line, thought it might be just another drill. But then once the people began dying around them, then those people remaining would see that this was the real thing.
So is it the White Knights were kind of, I suppose we call them now a visualization exercise.
And enacting the ritual.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? So they drank their flavor aid and sat down and waited to see what would happen, and then nothing happened. And so he did that several times in the jungle. He also had, even in the jungle and before in California, he sort of staged some attacks on himself. And in Northern California, he did that. And in the jungle, he did that. So he built the paranoia of his followers. Like, he was paranoid. And this is another kind of dictator handbook thing to do. So then, oh, they're after Jim, and so we feel so sorry for him, and by extension, they're after us.
Yeah. So one of the figures that is, well, very, I suppose, morally ambiguous in this whole thing is Marceline.
Yes.
Which again, it's a very, very difficult thing to tackle. And I think you did it very well in the book without overstepping any boundaries, which is
Thank you.
Marceline's role in this whole tragedy. She was a nurse. She was a very shy pastor's daughter who had been very sheltered in her upbringing. And then she suddenly meets this young intern at her hospital who was younger than her. Isn't that right? He was a couple of years younger.
4 years younger.
And she'd never had a proper boyfriend before. And she, was totally swept off her feet. Obviously, the guy had looks and he had charisma, and he seemed to have all of the personality traits that ticked all of her boxes, including, that he wasn't, or at least he didn't appear to be racist. He seemed to have the same vision for humanity as she did. And so it's really understandable how she got really swept in really quickly.
Yes.
However, she did not stop this terrible tragedy from occurring. And it's also, I think you've listened to what are known as the death tapes, isn't that right?
Yes.
The death tapes being a 40 or 50-minute recording of the, and which period does it capture?
Well, apparently, because the tape has been studied, there's something like 30 times in those 45 minutes where it got turned on and off.
Okay.
So things were left out. And it didn't only take 45 minutes for all those people to die. We don't hear her on the death tape. We hear him saying, "Mother, mother, mother." And he could have been talking to her like, "Mother, mother, stop protesting." That could have been. Or he could have been saying, "Mother, mother, mother," to all of the mothers there who were supposed to kill their children, and they were protesting. So we don't know what she was doing on the last day, but she did die from poison. Everybody died from poison except for Jim Jones and what they called his nurse, Annie Moore. So both of them died of gunshot wounds to the head, and they may have each killed themselves, or one of them killed the other, which I'm sure would have been Annie, who took the initiative rather than Jones before killing themselves. So she died like everyone else died of the poison. Marceline did. And she could have been out there raging and they shut her up or they put a gun to her head. That's very possible, but we'll never know that.
That's true. And also, she was very cowed by her husband, wasn't she? He was
Yes.
coercive and he controlled her. And like so many charismatic men, he regarded her as an extension of himself and not a person in her own right.
Yes, absolutely. And then she was this enabler, as were all of these women who were in his orbit, you know, and for a lot of them, there was a sexual flavor to their connection. And you know, this is the 70s. I mean, the women's movement has begun, but it's not out there yet in full force. And so Marceline had threatened to divorce him once back in California. And he said, "Oh no, you'll never see the kids again if you do this." And he was very serious. And he had these great lawyers. She didn't have any lawyers. And she accepted that, stayed with him.
But also, we have to remember the time, the 70s, you know, all of the women involved would have come with a lifetime of social conditioning.
Yes.
That you know, men and the courts would have supported him rather than her.
Probably, yes.
Even they tended to support the fathers rather than the mothers, and in fact, single women had a really tough time. I don't think American women had it much easier than British women at the time.
Right. So she was an enabler because she didn't feel like she could stand up for herself, and in the time period, you know, that was her reality. And so she stuck with him. He slept around constantly. Everybody knew it. He never hid it. And she accepted that that was part of her fate, if you will. She was a minister's daughter and she married a minister. And there's a whole kind of sociology that goes with that. In the US, it's called PK, Preacher's Kids. Like it's a whole way of being in the world when you're a child of a preacher.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, it must have been very comforting for her initially to leave, you know, that sheltered environment and believe that she was going to another sheltered environment. Anyway, but she was very much the breadwinner in the relationship. It's interesting. She
in the
always
beginning, absolutely.
Yeah, she earned the money, and he very much sent her out to work to earn money so that he could build up People's Temple. And so I suppose from that point of view, she had an unconventional role, but it was very much in the servitude of her husband, wasn't it?
Yes. And she believed in the mission of the People's Temple. She believed in social justice. She believed in equality of the races. And her work in California, she was supervisor of the state of California's state-sponsored nursing homes for the elderly. And she had always cared for the elderly. That was always important to her. So she would leave People's Temple and get in her car and drive all over the state and visit all these nursing homes everywhere. And that was a big, important job that she had. Now, the People's Temple also had some of those nursing homes, and I've read different things like, oh, they were wonderful to their old people, or they were horrible, you know, and I don't know which, you know, maybe it was a little of both.
And
because
also, it's so subjective, isn't it, Annie?
yeah,
People's experience. You could look after someone physically incredibly well, but mentally they might be miserable. There's
hmm
not, especially if people have been taken away from their homes and their environment and their families. There's only so much you can do to,
right.
so it is a very subjective thing. But it's really, she had this incredible nurturing nature,
Yes,
which is
yes,
why it's almost like such a betrayal of, the women and the children that looked up to her. That, yeah, and maybe we're being very unfair. Maybe she did try and stop it. It's,
yes,
we'll never know. So
yes,
I just think the way that you treated it in your book was as fair as you could possibly be, um, without being in possession of all the facts. And
right.
just for anyone listening, Annie's book is an imaginative retelling, but as faithful to the facts as possible. And it's an attempt to tell the story from the victim's point of view and not to focus overly on the, messianic Jim Jones. So, but just also, you're going to be mentioning the group of 8
Yes,
in your next book. Can you talk
yes,
about your next book a little bit?
yes. So when I did my first book, I did all this research. And at the time, right, when I started in 2004, it seemed like everything was about Jim Jones. And so I learned all about Jim Jones, and I thought, I'm not going to write about Jim Jones. I mean, he's been written about forever and continues to be. I want to write about the other people because 917 other people died that day. So I figured out who I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about his wife because at that time I could find very little information about Marcelin. I wanted a Guyanese voice. So I used the real person of the Guyanese ambassador to the United States. And then I had 2 sort of more rank and file followers, a young white woman and a young Black man. So I wrote all about them. I kind of lived with them forever. And there are so many other people and other stories I didn't get to include.
Well, of
And
course, every book is like you have to choose what to include, and there's always some
right.
very interesting and heartbreaking stuff you necessarily have to leave out.
Yes.
So,
So I decided, and I didn't know this all this time, that I was going to write another book about Jonestown. But I realized there were so many stories left I wanted to tell. And in the 20 years between when I started and when my book came out, of course, there's been tons of new material that's come out, both books, art, journalism, history, sociology, lot of video material. And so I decided I would return to my preferred form of fiction, which is the short story.
mhm.
And I realized I could tell a lot of stories that way instead of the novel, because I could have a story about one character that was just a few pages, for instance, and I could
Yes.
have a novella about another character with a lot of background, like this Jim Cobb person I mentioned earlier. Um, so that's the plan. I'm writing short stories. And again, I have to do all this choosing because I can't write about everyone and everything. But what I'm hoping to do is get some other voices who are, let's say, Jonestown adjacent. And one of them is the lawyer, Charles Gary, who was there that day, who was this really famous lefty lawyer who defended the Black Panthers and
Mm,
ended up, I mean, that very year, he ended up defending the People's Temple or working for the People's Temple. And he was there that day of the massacre. He and the other lawyer fled through the jungle. Like they weren't invited to the ritual. They were put off in a the most distant cabin you could be. And they
Right.
put them there, and they had an armed guard there on them. But then the armed guard left to go participate. And so, I'm thinking, well, they could have knocked over the poison if they had wanted to, or they would have been shot attempting it, but they didn't. They fled through the jungle. So that lawyer, Charles Gary, is going to be one of my characters as well.
For anyone watching, here's a copy of Annie's book. And actually, one of the things that's noteworthy is the cover. I don't know if you can see that closely,
Yeah.
but the cover, which goes around the back of the book, is by an artist named Joe Samuels, who, and I think that's interesting, your connection with Joe.
Do you want me to speak about that?
Sure, yes, please do.
Okay, so it's actually Joe Sam, period. That's how he signed all of his artwork. And he has recently passed away. But while I was working on the book, I reached out to him because I had seen a series of drawings, or just line drawings, that he had done. He was a Black San Franciscan, or somebody who lived in the Bay Area while all this was going on, and he was very moved by what happened. So he did all these incredible drawings, which are in another book about Jonestown called The Need for a Second Look at Jonestown, which is a collection of essays. So that's where I saw these the first time. And then I thought, well, that's what I want to be on the cover. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't in Jonestown, but he was an observer. And as I'm doing research about San Francisco at the time, San Francisco was reeling when the news of those deaths came in. Like, everybody in San Francisco seemed to know somebody who died in Jonestown.
Well, of course, because a lot of them came from the projects there, from the Bay Area, and so
yes.
it's only natural that that would have been the case.
Right. And so for those who don't know, this particular horrible, interesting fact is that 8 days after the massacre, the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone, was assassinated, along with Harvey Milk, the first out gay politician, by another politician who killed them both. And so the city was like the city of tragedy, of death and destruction for a very long time, but very intensely so for these 8 days. So anyway, that's what Joe Sam was experiencing when he made those drawings.
Well, yes, he did die very shortly after he agreed to let us use his cover drawing. But I hope it gave him a bit of joy.
Yes, I think so.
So
to be on the cover. In the other book, his drawings are all inside the book. But on mine, you can see, if it's facing out in a bookstore, you'll see his drawing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the last piece to really talk about is the effect on Guyana itself. This tragedy has really cast such a long shadow over that poor, benighted country, which, is desperately unfair. And, it's something that really should be discussed and talked about, because it's so little understood how.
Yes.
Whereas it's something that you try and address in your book, which, just to do it justice, which is important.
Yeah. Yeah, I should say that the very first novel about Jonestown was written by a British Guyanese writer, and it came out in the 90s, and I read it. And I mean, I read it during my research. I didn't read it in the 90s. And so he was sort of both sides. He was Guyanese, and then he was a Brit. And this was his home country. And it's a very powerful book. It's kind of like magical realism, so it's not necessarily easy to read. But anyway, I knew that I wanted a Guyanese voice there. And one of my sort of discoveries, if you will, in air quotes, was thinking about how, so British Guyana was a colony of Britain, and then it was surrounded by colonies of Spain, and then France, and the
Portugal.
Dutch, Portugal, right. So there were all these colonies in South America. And this was the only British one. And that was part of why Jones chose it, was because they spoke English.
Mm.
So that was important, because it's all these old people. It's hard to learn a new language when you're older, etc. And they had this socialist government at the time. So he was correct in that government was going to be friendly to him. They were. But there's a certain amount of colonization that I think about, more kind of metaphorical, but still real, where this white guy comes over from the United States, takes over this particular part of the country. And of course, he's directed there by the Guyanese government because they want him to sort of guard the Venezuelan border, because the Venezuelans are always wanting more land. And so they were strategic in where they pointed him. But with the way it ended up, I mean, we're almost at 50 years after the disaster, but at least for like the first 30 years after the disaster, if you said Guyana to anyone in the rest of the world, they'd either say, oh, isn't that where those crazy Americans killed themselves? Or they'd think you were saying Ghana, and they'd say, oh, isn't that in Africa?
Exactly.
So it was this way of sort of colonizing the memory of this country that Jones is responsible for, in my view. This isn't everybody's view. And it's only really recently, so here we are 47 years after, like last year, there was this New York Times article about the oil, because there's all this oil off the coast of Guyana, which of course is being exploited by all these foreign countries who were going there to get all this oil. But that was the first article I read that didn't mention Jonestown. And I clarified that with Dr. Moore, the head of the Jonestown Institute, where she's like, yeah, it's incredible, because every other article about Guyana up until that point would talk about this is where Jonestown happened. So maybe they're out of Jones's shadow now, and now they're going to be in Exxon.
I hope so. I hope so. But it is astonishing how even relatively young people who weren't even born then, if you mention it, they kind of know what you're talking about. It has really seeped into popular consciousness.
Right.
So,
well, the language of the Kool-Aid has become detached from the reality of what happened. So most people, especially young people who say drinking the Kool-Aid, they have no idea what it's attached to. That's true. What George Orwell called a dead metaphor, when it's a metaphor that no longer has an attachment to the image that provoked it. Like you say, towing the line, nobody thinks about their toes up to this line. You just say towing the line. Yeah.
Do you ever bother correcting people, or do you just let it go when you hear it?
It depends on the occasion. Saying drinking the Kool-Aid or drinking the Flavor Aid with a kind of nonchalance is what's really disgusting, because every time you say drinking the Kool-Aid, there are these 917 dead people, and it's not just to sort of write them off in this little flippant metaphor.
Yeah. I totally understand that. Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say, for those listening, the reason why Annie came to us is because she won the Chipping Norton Literary Festival competition, the short story competition in 2022. with her really excellent story, Kenny Winking, which is on our website now. So I'm going to put a little link to that as well, because so Annie won that story, and she did her reading over video link in the Chipping Norton Library. Do you remember that, Annie? Or the other
Yeah.
authors were actually physically present, which was nice.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, when she found out that I had set up a little publishing company, she sent me her manuscript and we decided to publish it, which is how we know each other. And it's been such a pleasure working with you, Annie, because not only is your book great,
Likewise.
and I'm just going to, for those of you who would like to understand the inner workings of Jonestown, and also not only Jonestown, but how a cult actually occurs. And it is really it's so important that people understand this, because people always feel really comfortable. It would never happen to me. It would
Yeah.
never happen to anyone I know, but actually it does happen to ordinary people and people who are talented and people who are clever. And there's no, you just don't know how it's going to get you. And you do not understand that you are a member of a cult until you are on the outside. And as soon as you become an outsider, you are not a member of a cult anymore. And while you're in it, it's not a cult to you. It's your family, it's your friends, it's your lifeline, it's your
Yes.
This is so important to keep to read these books, to especially Annie's, to understand exactly how it can happen.
Yeah.
And and it happens in the strangest places, like there are plenty of people who think the multi-level marketing is a cult, and things. So but let's not go into that, because that's a whole new discussion.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity, Cathy. I've
Oh,
enjoyed our
total pleasure.
conversation.
And it's really nice that we're able to do it in time for the 47th anniversary.
Yes.
And just for while obviously we don't want the shadow of Jonestown to haunt Guyana anymore, the people who were there deserve to be remembered, and also their families really deserve sympathy. But it's been really lovely chatting to you as ever, Annie, and we will chat soon.
Okay.
We'll
Thanks
talk about
again.
your next book.
Okay.
So, thank you for listening to the Inkspot podcast. Please like, subscribe, and comment. We love to hear from you. And please check out the books featured or mentioned in this episode, which are all linked in the description below. To all cooks, dog walkers, drivers, and anyone bored out of their gourd, we'll see you next time.